Welcome, thank you for coming. Subscribe and like for more stories. Police who have encountered sovereign citizens, what's your best story? Not a police officer or attorney, but I had a neighbor who was one of these. So, about 7 years ago, I moved to Chicago, and got a small apartment in a brownstone that had been converted into 3 apartments. My landlord was this nice elderly man who never gave me any problems. However, he warned me that the next door neighbor could be a bit batty, and to just ignore him if he tried to give me any trouble. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but about a week after I moved in, some guy I don't know knocks at my door. He's wearing a weird military-esque uniform that I don't recognize. So I'm like, oh, it's a weirdo, and don't answer the door. After a few minutes of more knocking, he pushes a fat manila envelope through my mail slot, and leaves. Curiosity piqued, I go to check it out, and the whole packet is basically telling me I have moved into the sovereign nation of, redacted to prevent identifying this guy, and here's all the citizenship paperwork I need to fill out. I had no idea WTF this was about, so I asked my upstairs neighbor, who'd lived there for over a decade. Apparently, the guy next door, and his wife had owned like 3 houses on this street, and were renting them out. When they got divorced, his wife got the building we were living in, and she promptly sold it to my current landlord. The sovereign citizen guy got shafted in the divorce, and decided that the court didn't have the jurisdiction to give his property to someone else. He declared the 3 buildings to be their own sovereign nation, and would try to break into them occasionally, which is why I had like 7 deadbolts on the door. I just figured it was Chicago, so I throw out the paperwork, and laugh, and go about my business. About 2 weeks later, I start getting junk mail addressed to this guy, so I gather it up, take it over to his house, and drop it off. I tell him to change the address they've got, because I don't want to receive his mail. He informs me as the king of nation, he is entitled to receive mail at any address in the country, and that my paperwork is a week overdue, so I need to pay the $150 late fee immediately. I roll my eyes, and leave. Go back to my apartment. Another week passes, and I'm off war and classes for a day, and the mailman comes by while I'm outside putting up Halloween decorations. He asks how my dad is doing. This would be very kind, except A, my father and I are not on speaking terms, and at that point hadn't spoken in 5 years, and B, my father lives in big cities, and would never have come within 100 miles of Chicago, even to visit me. So I ask the mailman WTF he's on about, and he says my dad has been chatting him up outside my apartment every day. It's creepy. I tell the mail carrier my father, and I don't speak, and he doesn't know where I live, so it can't have been my father. The mailman shakes his head, thanks me for telling him, and gives me my mail. I'm creeped out, but don't immediately suspect crazy neighbor guy. A few weeks later, I receive 2 certified letters that I have to sign for. While I do so, I notice the crazy neighbor is standing on his porch, watching me. I mention it to the mailman, as I'm signing, and he informs me that that's the guy who was claiming to be my dad. I take the letters, go inside, lock my door, and open these certified letters. One of them is a bill from the Office of the Interior of Nation, saying that my paperwork is a month late now, and I owe $1,500 in late fees, and because they had to use other methods to obtain my information, I also owe a $500 processing fee. The second envelope contains a lousy passport for nation, with my name as it appears on my mail, not as it appears on my driver's license. I go by my middle name, along with an ID card, both of which have a grainy picture of me obviously taken while I was on my way out of my apartment. I called the police, who came, took all the paperwork, and told me he does this to everybody, but they'd have a word with him. They told him he needs to leave me alone. I don't hear anything for another 3 months, until I get served. He's suing me in small claims court for $3,000 to cover my fees. I took off work, and showed up, and the judge laughed him out of there. I avoided him for the rest of my 1-year lease, and moved immediately to a different part of town. My uncle calls himself one, but it's kind of funny because he refuses to work, expects family, and the US government to cough up money or housing whenever he gets tired of living under a bridge. And he's super into big government. He just doesn't want to pay the consequences of it. I think he's confused. Prosecutor, not a cop, but I have seen a couple of these idiots in court. One guy insisted on representing himself despite the judge's constant pleas that he accept a public defender. He submitted documents to the court that were signed with his thumbprint in his own blood. Literally cannot make this up. During jury selection he would ask a question, and then spin around, and look at the judge to see if she was going to shut him down. He repeatedly asked/said things you can't during jury selection. That whole trial was a train wreck. He testified in his own defense, and said he wasn't born in New York like his birth certificate said, but instead in Northwest Africa, so I at least gave him props for getting the direction right if we are including New York as part of Africa. He was on trial for a suspended license, and dweed, so this was also much about nothing. He got convicted. The second one I saw started out way more reasonable. He did his own jury selection like the other guy, but was way more prepared, and seemed like he'd been there before. I was actually pretty impressed for a while, until he testified. So since he was representing himself, he didn't have an attorney to ask him questions when he testified like usual. In these situations, typically the person just gives a monologue about their side of the story. Not this guy. He stood at the podium, asked a question, then walked to the witness stand, sat down, and answered it. Then he got up, went back to the podium, asked a question, rinse, lather, repeat. He seemed fairly normal if a little deluded until that happened, and then we realized he was full-on crazy, just better at hiding it. He also got convicted for a suspended license, and having a concealed weapon. He carried a huge hunting knife on himself at all times. Lawyer here. I once faced off against one in court. He asked the master of the courts to override the Supreme Court of Canada. When the master wouldn't do that, our freeman tried to convince him to disbar me, saying that I'm not really an attorney. This was quite funny because in Canada we don't call lawyers attorneys. He later filed an affidavit claiming that he was a former client of mine, and thus I was acting in conflict of interest. Crazy. I've been very lucky, knock on wood, to not have had to deal with many. I am currently being sued by a sovereign citizen through an unrecognized as legitimate court, but so is every other person in the 100+ department, so I'm not just real concerned about it. He just decided to sue everybody, cause it works like that I guess. Even cops like me, who have never even seen him or knew who he was. The only other time I dealt with one was a very mild interaction in comparison to the ones you see on YouTube. I pulled a guy over for either expired tag or no tag. Can't remember now. I was like a first-year rookie. He was very odd throughout the whole thing. Didn't have his license on him. Used some alternate word like convey in place of driving. Like we were conveying to the store. Classic sign of sovereign citizen. When I asked him for his birthday he said, I don't know. So of course I'm like WTF. Yes you do. What is it? He goes, all I know is what I've been told. What? I can't remember anything about the day I was born. All I know is what people have told me. I thought about it for a second, and was kind of amused. Lol. I was thinking, well crap, what if my mom has been lying to me this whole time about what day I was born on? She totally could have pulled it off. I wouldn't have known any different. Lol. It's not like that old worn out birth certificate from the 80s is the most reputable looking document anyway. Joking, of course. Though I'll never know for sure. I finally had to go the route of asking, okay, fine. When were you told you were born? And he immediately spit out a birthday. That was mostly what I remember from it. I cited him for something, and as I'm telling him the ticket information, he kept interrupting me saying thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you just over and over. I finally just said F it, and quit talking, gave him his ticket, and he left. I think he was still a sovereign citizen in training. Lol. Obligatory. Not a police officer, but there was a security guard at the gym where I worked out in college who I became friends with. She told me that her grandmother, who was easily over 100 years old, was a sovereign citizen. Her best story was the time she decided to bring grandma with her to the DMV so she could get a new license. She left grandma in the waiting room, and went up to the counter, only to smell faint smoke a few minutes later. She turns around, and sees her grandmother, this tiny, gnarled black woman who was maybe 90 pounds soaking wet effing toking up in the middle of the DMV. A small crowd has formed around her in shock. When the cops show up, she tries to pull the sovereign citizen shtick on them, which doesn't work. The cops, who aren't sure what to do with a pothead so old that she'd probably die on the ways to the station, just kick her, and the security guard out. Security guard didn't get her license. Another time, the guard decides she's going to go out clubbing, and Granny demands that she comes with. While they're out, the guard loses sight of grandma, and searches frantically for her in this dark, loud bar. Eventually, she encounters a guy who says that Granny and his friend went to the motel across the street. The security guard tracks them down, and finds out her grandma is soliciting this 20-year-old guy for sex, and offers to pay him $100, and weed in the lobby of the motel. The motel owner calls the cops, who show up completely bewildered at the situation. Again, no arrests are made, the security guard just takes grandma home. Yeah. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell for more stories delivered to you. Thanks for listening. See you later.